James 1 verse 13, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's fully grown, it gives birth to death. My title for the devotion today is The Big, Ugly, Fat Lie. And this is what James is going to be telling us, that there's a lie that comes and seeps in, especially from where we left off yesterday, when we are going through trials and temptation and hardship. Something is coming. Something is going to seep in there. So strap yourself and let's join in. There's a trial that is coming. We cannot avoid it. In fact, James tells us yesterday, count it all joy when you face trials, when you go through hardship, when you go through pain. James tells us it's coming. Let's say you're a student, you're studying for your exams, and because you're studying for your exams, you feel very stressed because you're underprepared. A thought is solicited into your mind. Acha niandike Mwakenya. Let me grab a Mwakenya. And then as you start writing that Mwakenya, if somebody was to ask you what you're doing, is it right? You'll be like, no. But why are you doing it? Or maybe let's say you're an athlete and you are playing football, or maybe you're running the marathon, and then you realize, I am getting older. And you look at the younger guys who are running against, these guys are fit. These guys, their metabolism is in check. These guys, their muscles, their tissue are just aligning, and you can't compete them. So what do? You start taking in performance-enhancing drugs. If somebody was to ask you, aren't you cheating? You'll be like, yes, I'm cheating. But why are you cheating? Because in that moment, it seems like the right thing to do. If you were to be taken to an exam, a moral exam, and you are to be asked, what you're doing, is it wrong? You'd be like, yes. And then you'll ask yourself, then why are you doing it? It's because when hard times lead us to make hard decisions. Sometimes hard times can lead us to make destructive decisions. Verse 13, James looks and says, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. So James tells us where this temptation comes from. And number one, he tells us, not God. He tells us that God cannot do it. It's inconsistent with the very nature of God. Sometimes we say, all these things I feel, why did God give me these feelings? How can I act on these feelings? I feel all these feelings, why did God give them to me? Let me tell you, the Bible says these temptations do not come from God. Then where do these temptations come from? He says this in verse 14, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own desires and enticed. He grabs three words there. He says lured, enticed. Number one, that lured word, that means an intention of the mind, that your mind conceives this thing and puts an intention to it. And then enticed, that's the desires of the heart being affected. And then eventually we enact the will. That is when we actually act on that feeling. You see, temptation, this is how I'd say James defines it. Temptation is the luring of the mind's intention and the enticement of the heart that causes you to enact the will. It is temptation is the luring of the mind's intention and the enticement of the heart's affection that pushes you to enact the will. You see, each one is lured and enticed by their own desires. You see, James makes it very personal. This process is tailor-made for you. It is tailor-made for you. What lures someone does not mean it will lure everyone else. What lures you will not lure me. Whatever makes you feel like it's shiny is not shiny to me. Maybe to one person, or the temptation that might come for them might be something totally different for myself. Maybe for one person it might be alcohol, for somebody else it might be a very heavy sexual temptation. It is tailor-made for you. And the Bible says this, it comes from within you. That's what the Bible says. It will do us well to know how does this temptation get to you. It will do you well for you to know this is how this temptation gets to me. What's the thing that gets to you? That would be my question. What's the thing that gets to you? Because this is a principle I'd love to share with you. What you think about is what you care about. And what you care about is what you will chase. Let me say that again. What you think about is what you care about. What you care about is what you will chase. Think about what you think about? What do you think about, especially when you're alone? Think about what you think about. Paul tells Timothy, watch your life and your doctrine. In doing so, you will save both yourself and those who are hearing you. Verse 15, it says, then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it's fully grown, it gives birth to death. When you're going through temptation, number one, look downstream. Look downstream and see where it leads you. Pause and think about what will happen if you enact the will. What will happen if you actually go into that room with that lady? What will happen if you walk into that bar? What will happen if you start smoking that joint that somebody is passing to you? What will happen if you start using those things that you know are harmful to you? What will happen to you? Look downstream and get to see what is happening. James tells us that temptation gives birth to the desire, gives birth to sin, and sin gives birth to death. Look downstream. Where does this thing lead you? Look at it. Where does it go? Pause and think about what will happen, and what will happen especially when you enact the will. You start by drinking that bottle. At the end of the day, you feel more empty than the way the bottle feels. James looks at downstream and says, hey, this thing, this desire leads to sin. And when sin is fully blown, it is going to lead to death. That's what James is telling you. So what do? James tells us that this desire will give birth to sin. He uses the analogy that the desire, when we enact the will, it will give birth to sin. First of all, I love that he uses the analogy of giving birth to. Whenever we talk about giving birth, we talk about something giving birth to life. But James grabs the same analogy and says it gives birth to death. He's using this imagery just to show us that how severe this thing is. Whenever we think about giving birth, it's actually giving birth to life. When a lady is due and gives birth to a baby, you know what? We're thinking about the new life that has come into earth. But then James says this, when the temptation comes, that desire comes, it gives birth to sin. And after that sin is fully blown, it gives birth to death. James says, look downstream. Where does this thing lead you? It will lead you to death. James is not telling us just look downstream. James is also telling us look upstream. Where is this thing coming from? Where is it stemming from? You know what? James is telling us look up. Don't just look down where it's leading, because we've seen when we look down, we see this desire will give birth to sin, and this sin will give birth to death. And that's where I'm headed if I go down this road. But then he looks and grabs this thing and says, also look upstream. Where does it come from? And he says where it comes from deception. He says this, don't be deceived. Every good and perfect gift comes from the Father of lights, in whom there is no shifting shadows. He says, do not be deceived. And this is the big fat lie. This is the big fat lie. The big fat lie is that we do not believe God is a good Father who cares about you. Sometimes the reason why we enact that temptation, when we are lured and enticed and enact it, it's because we do not believe the Lord, our God, is a good Father. And let's take a case study. Let's take Eve. What happened to Eve? In the Garden of Eden, Eve had everything that it takes. Eve was in the perfect setting. She had everything, yet Satan managed to convince her. And what was she convinced about? She was convinced that she did not have everything she needed. The Bible tells us the tree was in the middle of the garden. They had to walk past through every other tree and go through everything else that God had given them to get to that one thing they felt like they did not have. Isn't it the same thing that happened with Satan? Had everything in heaven, but then just felt like I need more. And that's where the big fat lie comes in. Temptation comes in to give us an alternative for God. Now, James told us as we began, this temptation is not from God. One thing we know, it's not from God. But then he tells us that there's a big fat lie. And this lie is this, that God is not a good Father who cares for us. And sometimes we believe the lie. If I want to live a sexually free lifestyle, I have to distance myself from God. If I want all the money and to be corrupt, I have to distance myself from God so that I can be corrupt. Patrick Cairns is a leading voice in addiction. This is what he says. The root of addiction is feeling unloved and unlovable. That if you find actually the root of anything addictive, you will find that there's a deep feeling on feeling unloved and unlovable. We go down sad roads because we feel unloved. We go down sad roads because we feel when the trial is too much, the temptation is too much, I cannot handle it. We need to stop and look, what are some of these areas that lead me down temptation? What are some of the things that I entertain? Because James tells us trials are coming. And when trials come, what will happen? Temptation is not too far from it. And when temptation comes, it wants to lure you, it wants to entice you so that you can enact the will. And when you enact the will, that leads to sin. And when sin comes and it's fully blown, sin leads to death. Replace it completely. The ministry of Jesus begins when God looks down on him and God says, "This is my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased." Jesus has done nothing that God to be pleased with him. Jesus has done nothing. At this point in ministry, he's not even stepped out and walked on any water. He's not fed 5,000 people, yet God tells him, God affirms and says, "This is my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased." You see what God is doing there? He's affirming him that it's not what you're doing that is making you my son. I am not pleased because of what you do. I am pleased in you. And you can rest in this assurance that God is a good God, that our Father is a good God. And in him, we find our very living and our very being. And one way to fight temptation well is to know that we serve a good God. We serve a good Lord who cares for us, who loves us, and who is pleased with us. That the big fat lie is that God is not a good father. Yet James tells us every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. Is that a reality in your life? I know for sure for my life, I have struggled with that truth. And many times I've gone down some sad roads, made decisions that I'm not proud of, just because I don't think God is a good father. There's a song we sing about the reckless love of God. And if we think about God in that way, that God is reckless, no, God is not a reckless human being. But you think about how God would not allow anything to come in the way of you and him, that's when we begin to know that he's a good, good father, and that he cares for us, and that he loves us, and that he will take care of you. And when trials come, like James says, trials will come, and they will test your faith. And when trials test your faith, you know what else is going to happen? Temptation is going to find its way in. Don't be deceived to take a left or right. Look downstream and see where does this lead. Look upstream and see where this deception is coming from. And then it tells us this and concludes by saying, do not forget that the biggest fat lie is that God does not care for you. God does care for you. He really does care for you. He will take care of you. When luck is in keeping, when there's problem with poverty, when there's problem financially, when there's a problem in school, this is what we need to rest in. That our God is a good father, and in him there's no shifting shadows. Friends, that would be it for me today. Just to remind you that even though these trials will come and temptations will seek to come your way, we know that God is a good father, and in him there's no shifting shadows.